Welcome to another Dr. Sadler's Honest Book Review. This is a series in which we look at recent to fairly recent works in philosophy, psychology, and, understood in a very broad sense, so also including, not just ethics, but leadership, personal development, self-help, philosophy of emotion, which this book is going to figure in a little bit. And so the book that we have this time is by E.B. Bartels. It's called Good Grief on Loving Pets Here and Hereafter. And it's an exploration of exactly that. What is the process of grieving like, not just for us, but for many other people? What sort of lessons can we learn? And does it play an important role within our life? So, got a lot to go over having to do with this work. I always like to begin with the three big S's: style, structure of the work, and giving a summary. And so I'm going to actually begin with the third, which will lead kind of into the first of these as well. So this is essentially a book of stories that are strung together around a number of common themes with a sort of progression built into it. And it is indeed all about grief and whether grief is a good thing or a bad thing, what we can do or what other people have done to make it better, to integrate it into our lives. And it has to do entirely with our relationships to animals, specifically to pets, but not exclusively pets. There's discussions, for example, of racehorses and other animals as well. So I would say that it's essentially a narrative book that is centered around a number of explorations of important ideas and reflections on that. The narrator herself is talking about her own experiences, but she's also looking at what other people have to say. It is very well written in terms of style. This is, one of those books that clearly has been written for the general public in mind. It's got, the usual stuff in the back with the suggestions for, what to read on these selected sources, occasionally with a little bit of, commentary, mostly in the text itself, some acknowledgments, an introduction, and then we get to the structure of the chapters. And, it's kind of an interesting organizational way to structure the book. There are 8 chapters in here. Each of them starts with a kind of animal, and sometimes we get very specific. And then it also talks about some phenomenon. So chapter 1 is fish and fossils. Chapter 2, birds and bonding. Chapter 3, rodents and responsibility. You notice that there's some, alliteration going on here as well. I may as well go through the rest of them. Chapter 4 is turtles and taxidermy. Chapter 5, now we get very specific, betas, a certain kind of fish, and burials. Chapter 6, stallions and stardom. Chapter 7, felines and feelings. Chapter 8, canines and community. And you notice that we're finishing up with the 2 most common types of pets in American settings, although we've gone through quite a few other ones, fish and birds and, reptiles and rodents of other sorts, and then, talk about horses as well along the way. So, the chapters aren't exclusively about the particular type of animal that they're talking about. So rodents and responsibility isn't just rodents. Betas isn't just about burying beta fish. There's other things involved as well. And Bartels is going to tell a number of other stories along the way that have to do with her own development, her relationships with her family members, friends, college roommates, people like that along the way. So I think that gives you a good sense of how the book is actually set up. If I had to say what the key ideas of this book happen to be, we can easily identify a number of them. I would say the biggest idea is that at least some people care quite a lot about their pets, and they want to have ways to, you could say, memorialize them. The book actually begins by talking not just about her own early childhood experiences, but also with going to pet cemeteries. And that's an interesting phenomena, isn't it? Going way back, by the way, in America, there's actually stories about this in Yves Lenoir. So, going back well into the probably 30s, 40s, 50s at that time. So people do care about their pets. They have memories of them. They want to find ways to continue some sort of relationship to those that they've lost. There's actually some interesting discussion about different modes of, we could say, preservation of parts of them or even the whole. There's a discussion of mummification. There's this interesting thing about taxidermy and a company called, a company that has cuddle clones, right? That a person can have a stuffed animal made that will then include the ashes of the pets. There's a lot of different ways people are doing this. And why? What centers that? Well, when we form a relationship with a pet or a companion animal, we are forging a genuine relationship. It's not a human-human relationship. It's not, exactly the same as a friendship with a human being, but there's something pretty important going on there. Some people talk about their pets as if they're their children as well, and it's not exactly the same thing as having your own children or adopting children, human children, but there's something analogous. I think that's a useful way to think about it, and that makes us quite vulnerable to the grief that naturally occurs when we lose pets. And she is going to talk about this very early on. I like this phrase. She says, in this way, grieving pets is a disenfranchised grief, which can make it hard to know how to process and honor it. But there's freedom in that, too. With social acceptance comes social standards and expectations. So it's charting out a developing area of our lives where there's quite a bit of diversity. The bonding that we have with many of the animals that we might take on, particularly fish, certain kinds of birds, rodents, but also dogs and cats and horses, among others, might be relatively short-term. When you get a puppy or a kitten, you are basically putting yourself on the hook for taking care of that animal for 10 to 20 years, but it's rare that they're going to live beyond that. So human beings have a greater longevity. Now, of course, tortoises that they talk about in the work, certain kinds of birds might outlive us. And then you got to think about who's going to take care of them and how is this going to be handled? And will the animal itself grieve you when, you pass away? There's also some interesting discussion. I mentioned companies that do things. So there's, entire industries that have been around for a while to help people deal with the grief that they feel, to provide them, we talked about pet cemeteries, a place that you can go to visit your lost love, a dog, a hamster, whatever it may be. But, there's taxidermy, there's preservation of ashes in different ways, turning them into diamonds, and there's even mummification. And, that's quite interesting to look at as well, because as it turns out, that goes back a very, very long way, right? So there's, ancient Egyptians who were mummifying certain animals, particularly cats, way back then. So people have had responses to the loss of their pets that, reflect this yearning to maintain a relationship, to hold on even in the grieving. There's also, and I think this is a important part of the work, there's a lot of discussion about the feeling of guilt over perceived failures. So, she writes, we try so hard, but the truth is we're clumsy animals ourselves. Humans can't predict or prepare for everything, or anything really, but there's something about our role as protectors and caretakers that makes us feel a particularly deep guilt in our failures. And there are so many different heartbreaking ways to feel like you've failed. My friend told me about her aunt who was devastated when she had to euthanize her dog because she couldn't afford the surgery that could have saved his life. Another friend of a friend was carrying a basket of laundry and accidentally knocked over a chair that severely injured her Senegal parrot, Darzi, which ultimately led to his death. Some people deny or ignore symptoms of a pet's illness until it's too late. And here's where it becomes autobiographical. And sometimes you actively give up on your pet. These are realities that do need to be faced up to when we're thinking about these matters in a real and serious way. There's also a lot of discussion about the difficulties that have to do with the end of life, particularly how do we assess whether a pet is suffering or in pain, how do we conceptualize their quality of life, and how do we make decisions whether or not to euthanize a pet. So there's actually some good, long, sustained discussions of that, not shearing away from it or just using euphemisms or anything like that. And there's quite a diversity of points of view on these sorts of things. So, she writes, every situation and every pet is different, and no one knows your animal like you do. The timing is something you have to figure out for yourself. Many people put off even considering euthanasia for as long as they can, perhaps as a coping mechanism, a way to deny the animal's coming death. Euthanasia is often seen as the absolute last resort. People want to make sure they've exhausted every other possibility before even thinking about the needle. Part of me wonders, this goes back to the guilt thing, if this is because people care what other people think. They don't want to be seen as someone who gave up too quickly on their pet, jumping to euthanasia to avoid a hard, sad, and expensive decline. But so many pet caretakers I've spoken with have told me that only long after their pet had died did they realize how much they dragged out their animal's suffering and pain simply because they didn't want to let go. There are good days and bad days. It's easier just to focus on the good days and use them to convince yourself that it isn't time yet. And of course, animals have evolved to hide signs of illness and pain. Showing weakness turns an animal into prey in the wild. Most pets actively try not to show us if they're hurt or ill, right? So she also talks about how the attitudes towards euthanasia have changed over time in a way that I think is quite helpful. Another thing that she discusses later on in the work are the variety of religious attitudes, perspectives, rituals that deal with the death of animals. Do they have souls? Do they continue on? Are they in some way connected with us? And, that's a discussion, we're going to get to this a little bit later, that's kind of hit or miss, but at least covers a few of the major ideas that one might run across, depending on, what religious beliefs one is looking at. So, I also would say, if we're thinking about key ideas, this is a book that is really, if I had to hazard a guess, I would say 70% narrative and 5% genuine philosophy, and then 25% looking at what experts of one sort or another have to say as ways of informing the stories and narratives. And that's not bad. It's a great way to often convey ideas that could be difficult or complex or deep for people. So those are some of the key ideas of what is going on in this work. All right, what is good about this work? I think that she's pretty brutally honest about matters that are being narrated, including mistakes. There's not a lot of just wallowing. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't say there's any maudlin stuff in here. I like that because I'm not into that sort of overwrought emotion, but she's being very emotionally honest, and she's also saying, at certain times I had the wrong perspective, I made the wrong decision. She talks about other people who have done this as well, and I think that is quite important because people do need to hear that. And another thing that people do need to hear is that sometimes you don't always have the right decision, the right option in front of you, and you may not know that the choice that you make really was the best one that you could have made, given all the circumstances, because we don't know all of the circumstances. So that's pretty important. She is an excellent storyteller. So if you enjoy narratives, she's great at telling her own stories. She's also great at taking other people's stories and, retelling them, drawing out some lessons from them or interesting ideas from them. She's also, quite good at putting forth some digressions, we could say, in interesting ways. So I'm actually going to bring up one that I myself particularly liked. There are 4 kinds of animal mummies. The first, victual mummies, are animals intended as food for people in the afterlife. Usually these mummies didn't contain the entire animal, just the part of Pharaoh would want to eat for eternity. So that's one. Votive mummies are animals that carried messages to the gods on behalf of human. The animals chosen for this service tended to resemble the gods themselves: cats for Bastet, ibises for Thoth, crocodiles for Sobek. Sacred mummies, third kind, bulls, cats, crocodiles, ibises, baboons, were thought to be reincarnations of the gods because of their distinctive markings. She talks about seeing one of these. And then the fourth and final type of animal mummy is the one that Ikram calls the most charming, the pet mummy, right? So, this is quite interesting to learn about. And it's not a digression in the sense of it's not relevant to what's being discussed. It's completely irrelevant, but it's, it's a meandering. This is a great narrative device. And there's a lot of those in this, I would say. I think that there's, some good drawing on the experts. One that I particularly thought was important and apt in talking about grief. So the person who really wrote the book on animal grief is Barbara King. And so, there's a couple pages in here where she's bringing up insights and some of the things that King herself talks about. Another thing that I liked about this was the discussion of what it is that vets have to go through in helping to guide people, often without much training on their own part, to make these end-of-life decisions for their pets. And there's, this is an area where we probably need a lot more support and work and training. She has an interesting proposal, which it could be possible in some places, although I'm not sure that this would actually work for everybody. But she's got this idea that, maybe we need social workers who would actually help people in making these decisions, and maybe they'd support the veterinarians themselves, right? these are quite difficult decisions that wind up having to be made. So she's here's the thing. She talks about a researcher noticing the kind of tension that happens and the nervousness between clients and vets, somebody who has a doctorate in social welfare, and suggesting that maybe animal hospitals should have somebody like a social worker present, someone to help translate medical phrases into common language, to help talk through difficult decisions, to assist in weighing the pros and cons. I mean, maybe something like a medical ethicist, which we have in hospitals, somebody who's got philosophical training, and that might be helpful as well. I think that's a really solid idea that has to be developed more in the future. So those are the things that I particularly liked about the work. What did I find problematic about the work? So really just two things, one of which is quite specific, the other of which is a little bit more broad in its scope, I would say. So in the discussion of religious attitudes, she says something that, I mean, in a very broad sense, maybe you could say that it's correct, but specifically it's not. So she says, in 1990, Pope John Paul II reversed course on centuries of Catholic dogma and said that animals do have souls. Well, animals have been said to have souls for a very long time by Catholic philosophers. It's just a question of whether they have immortal souls of the type that human beings have. I mean, if you're Thomas Aquinas, who's kind of a big name in Catholic theology, you say dogs and cats have souls because every living thing has a soul, but it's just not the same kind of soul as a human being. And was that ever Catholic dogma? Not really. So I think that's, somebody who's straying outside of their area, repeating some interesting but mistaken ideas and using them as a foil for things to say, some progress has been made. So that's kind of a small misstep. I would also say, so if this is going to be a work that's basically, storytelling with some occasional insights, that's great. If that's all you want from the book. If you're going to this book because you want deep thought carried out in a sustained way about our relationships emotionally, ethically, institutionally, and historically with our animal companions or pets or even, racehorses or things like that, you're probably going to find this to be interesting, but not going anywhere far or deep enough. So it really depends on what kind of book you want it to be. I think that, for example, on animal grief, I mentioned Barbara King earlier. She's got a great book on that. I've done a review of that book myself, and I find that to be a very helpful guide. The reason I actually got a hold of this book is because I'm doing work on how to deal with end-of-life decisions about pets and grieving and things like that. And I found it, it's got a lot of good stories. It's got a few good insights. I think it could be good as a starting point for people. But it's definitely not the definitive book on these matters. Now, whether or not that's a deficit or not depends on where you are. So not that big of a negative in my view. Okay, so my final thoughts on this work. Like I said, if you want something that's more storytelling, peppered with some occasional insights that span the various chapters that are kind of working up towards a kind of general conclusion and, looks over a lot of interesting material, then maybe you want to get this book. If you're struggling with your own decisions about end of life for your your animal companions or pets, or you're dealing with your own grief or feelings of guilt, this might actually be quite helpful. I don't think it's a great book. I would say it's a decent to good book. So I give it a kind of qualified endorsement. If you want to get it might be good for you. You probably won't read the book twice, I would say, and come back to it as a resource over and over again. But, that's all right. So maybe it's less a book to purchase and one to get from the local library. So that's my take on Good Grief on Loving Pets Here and Hereafter.